Keeper of the Lost City's Everblaze, Chapter 37. Sophie and Fitz sprinted towards the city, weaving around rivers of melted jewel lava. Dozens of buildings had already oozed away, with more catching fire every second, and Sophie sent a silent plea into the night, hoping no one was inside. "We have to find my dad," Fitz yelled, as Sophie stopped and pressed her hands into her head. "I know, I'm trying to track him." Her mind could trace the sound of someone's thoughts to their exact location, but she was having a hard time concentrating. Between the heat and the crackling and the pounding of her heart, she wished she could take a deep breath to clear her throbbing head, but the smoke was too thick and bitter, so she closed her eyes and forced herself to tune out everything except for the voice she needed to find. For several seconds, she couldn't hear anything. Then Tiergan's panicked, overwhelmed thoughts filled her mind. "They're by the river," she shouted, cradling the bottles of quintessence as she took off downstream with Fitz right behind her. Everything burned, her chest, her legs, her eyes, but she pushed herself to move faster, wanting to cry with relief when she spotted what looked like a makeshift lab, complete with glowing beakers and test tubes and some sort of bubbling cauldron. Standing next to a white-robed figure was a blissfully familiar face. "Tiergan!" Sophie shouted, doubling her speed. He ran towards her once he spotted her, and even though she knew he wasn't a hugger, and she was carrying a large bag of very explosive bottles, she threw her arms around him, clinging to him in the eerie flickering light. "Where's my father?" Fitz asked, between wheezing breaths. "He's safe. He went with Lady Galvin to collect the only other ingredients needed for the frisson. She's been giving us a long lecture on how we should have kept some in the reserve from last time." "She's right," Sophie said, surprised she actually agreed with her ex-alchemy instructor about anything. "I know." Tiergan took the bag of quintessence from her and led them back towards the lab. "I'll have Kessler start preparing this." "Kessler's here?" Sophie asked, wondering if that meant Dex was as well. "Every alchemist we could find is here, plus a fleet of gnomes who volunteered to help us distribute the frisson. The fires should be out quickly once we have what we need." Sophie hoped he was right, and she felt better handing the quintessence over to Kessler and seeing him immediately add some to the cauldron. He also assured her that Dex was at home and safe. Still, it was agonizing to stand there, watching the beautiful jeweled city melt in the flames, while Kessler stirred beakers and measured liquids, and they waited and waited and waited. Fitz had worn a groove into the ground from his pacing when Alden's familiar voice called, "Thank goodness you're both back," and Sophie and Fitz ran to tackle him. "I was so worried about you," Alden told them, hugging so tight Sophie couldn't breathe, but maybe that was a good thing. "Ugh, why do you stink?" Fitz asked, leaning back as far as Alden would let him. "Sasquatch saliva was the last ingredient we needed." "But we got it," a sharp voice said behind him, making them realize Alden hadn't returned alone. Lady Galvin, who looked less terrifying than usual, with green Sasquatch fur sticking out of her bun, held up a large flask filled with yellow, cloudy liquid. Even though it had a cork, Sophie could smell the rancid stench radiating from it. "I'm assuming you collected the quintessence?" she asked Sophie, stalking over to Kessler and examining his cauldron. "It looks like you managed to do it without anything exploding either. Well done. Now we can finally clean up this mess." Everyone cheered as they finished brewing the first batch of frisson, which turned out to be a shimmering silver powder. But Sophie didn't feel like celebrating as she watched a group of gnomes set to work dusting the first line of flames. All she could see was the destruction all around her, and she knew none of it would have happened if she hadn't healed Finton. She closed her eyes and let the truth nestle deep into her brain. She needed to face it, accept it, own up to the reality. Partially for her own sanity, but mostly because there would be sure backlash when the news hit the public. "You two have had a very long night," Alden said, joining Sophie and Fitz on the hill where they'd been watching. "I think it's time we go home, don't you?" "Do Grady and Adeline know about the Everblaze?" Sophie asked. "Not yet. I didn't think it would be wise to involve them until the fires were contained, but now there is much to explain." Sophie met his eyes, realizing there was a deep emotion behind the stress and exhaust and worry. "Grief. Everyone's okay, right?" she said quietly. "Nobody was..." She couldn't say it. Hated even thinking of it. "We'll talk in the morning," Alden told her, offering her a hand. "No, you have to tell me what happened. I can't..." A lump lodged in her throat, threatening to choke her. If someone was hurt, I need to know. Alden's lips formed one word, but at the last second he changed it to, I really think you should rest before we talk about this. Like I'll be able to sleep now. She's right, Dad, Fitz agreed. Alden looked about 1,000 years old as he sat down between them and buried his face in his hands. I don't know how to tell you this. The words seemed to swallow the air around them. Alden had told Sophie she'd be facing a tribunal, and that she had to go to exile, and that she had to leave her human family and have her whole life erased. What could be worse than that? And then she knew. Someone's dead, she said quietly, as her mind ran through the list of names and faces. It was hard to remember who she'd seen safe and who she hadn't, but as she played the night back, she realized someone was missing. Fitz reached for her hand, squeezing it so hard it probably would have hurt if Sophie hadn't already been numb. Still, she felt a million needles press into her heart when Alden swallowed back a sob and said, Actually, it was 2 people. Both Finton and Counselor Kenrick never made it out of the tower.